The fluorescent lights hummed their sterile tune inside the 7th floor conference room at Langley. On the morning of March 15th, 1985, casting harsh shadows across the faces of men who had spent decades learning to trust no one, not even themselves, Colin Mackenzie adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and studied the photograph spread before him on the polished oak table. A grainy surveillance shot taken 3 weeks earlier outside a Georgetown restaurant, showing a middle-aged American in a rumpled suit passing an envelope to a figure whose face remained frustratingly obscured by shadow and circumstance. The photograph would change everything. Though none of the 8 men gathered in that room could have imagined the breadth of damage they were about to uncover. The networks that would collapse like dominoes across 2 continents, or the bitter truth that would emerge from the most devastating mole hunt in Western intelligence history, that their greatest enemy had not been the Soviet Union's legendary spy apparatus, but the paranoia and suspicion that had consumed their own ranks like a cancer, turning ally against ally in a wilderness of mirrors where truth became indistinguishable from deception. This is the story of how the West finally struck back against decades of Soviet penetration, drawn from declassified files and public archives that reveal the hidden machinery of the most consequential spy war of the 20th century, a shadow conflict, fought not with bullets and bombs, but with secrets and lies, loyalty and betrayal, in the gray zones between nations, where ordinary men and women became instruments of history's most dangerous game. The hunt for Soviet moles in Western intelligence services would consume 3 decades, destroy careers, topple governments, ultimately reshape the entire architecture of counterintelligence. But it began not with a dramatic defection or a smoking gun discovery, but with something far more insidious: doubt, creeping like fog through the corridors of power, whispering questions that demanded answers no one was prepared to give. James Jesus Angleton stood at the window of his office on the 6th floor of the original CIA headquarters building in the winter of 1961, watching snowflakes drift past the glass, while his mind processed the implications of what Anatol Golitsyn had just told him about the scope of Soviet penetration operations across the Western Alliance. Angleton was 44 years old then, a thin, ascetic man with deep-set eyes, who had already spent 17 years hunting Soviet spies, and who would spend the next 13 years constructing the most comprehensive and ultimately destructive counterintelligence operation in American history. Golitsyn had arrived in Helsinki just days before Christmas, 1961, a mid-level KGB officer from the First Chief Directorate who claimed intimate knowledge of Soviet operations spanning 2 decades and 3 continents. Unlike previous defectors who offered tactical intelligence about specific operations or agents, Golitsyn brought something far more dangerous: a strategic framework that suggested the entire Cold War was an elaborate deception, orchestrated by Moscow's center to lull the West into complacency, while Soviet agents burrowed deep into the heart of NATO governments, intelligence services, and military commands. The Russian spoke in careful English during those first debriefing sessions in a safe house outside Washington, his pale hands gesturing as he described what he called the monster plot, a coordinated campaign of penetration, deception, and disinformation designed to neutralize Western intelligence capabilities from within. According to Golitsyn, every major Western intelligence service had been compromised, from the CIA to Britain's MI6 to the security services of France, West Germany, and the Scandinavian countries. The scope of the alleged penetration was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. Golitsyn claimed that KGB officers had been placed in positions where they could influence policy decisions at the highest levels of Western governments, where they could identify and neutralize Western intelligence operations against the Soviet Union, and where they could feed disinformation back to their handlers that would shape Western perceptions of Soviet capabilities and intentions. But Golitsyn offered more than just allegations. He provided a methodology for understanding Soviet operations that appealed to Angleton's intellectual vanity and deep-seated paranoia about the communist threat. The KGB, according to Golitsyn, operated on principles of long-term strategic deception that made Western intelligence services look like amateur operations run by Boy Scouts who still believed in the fundamental honesty of human nature. The immediate impact of Golitsyn's revelations rippled through the intelligence community like seismic shocks. Within weeks of his arrival, joint task forces were established to investigate his claims. Operations officers were reassigned or placed under surveillance, and the first tentative steps were taken toward what would become the most paranoid and destructive period. Angleton embraced Golitsyn's theories with the fervor of a true believer, discovering a new religion. Here was a framework that explained every intelligence failure, every operational setback, every piece of contradictory information that had puzzled counterintelligence analysts for years. If the Soviets were running a massive deception operation, then nothing could be taken at face value. Every defector was suspect. Every piece of intelligence had to be analyzed for signs of disinformation, and every colleague might be working for the other side. The hunt for moles became Angleton's obsession and his weapon. From his position as chief of CIA's counterintelligence staff, he launched investigations into hundreds of agency personnel, paralyzed operations against Soviet targets by questioning the bona fides of every source and every piece of intelligence, and created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that would poison the agency's effectiveness for more than a decade. The paranoia spread beyond Langley like a contagion. In London, Arthur Martin of MI5 and Stephen de Mowbray of MI6 became converts to Golitsyn's theories and began their own hunt for Soviet penetration in British intelligence. In Ottawa, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Security Service launched investigations that would destroy careers and ultimately lead to the creation of an entirely new civilian intelligence organization. The methodology of mole hunting became a dark art practiced by specialists who learned to see patterns of betrayal in the most innocent activities. Late nights at the office could indicate meetings with Soviet handlers, or they could indicate dedication to duty. Foreign travel might be cover for clandestine contacts, or it might be legitimate business. Expensive lifestyles could suggest payments from Moscow, or they could indicate family money or successful investments. Everything became suspect because nothing could be proven conclusively, and the absence of evidence was itself taken as evidence of sophisticated tradecraft by the opposition. The hunters created their own methodology for distinguishing genuine defectors from false ones, loyal officers from traitors. But that methodology was based on assumptions that could never be verified and theories that became self-fulfilling prophecies. The case of Yuri Nosenko illustrated the deadly logic of the mole hunters at work. When Nosenko defected from the KGB in February 1964, he brought information that contradicted some of Golitsyn's allegations and suggested that Soviet penetration of Western intelligence was far less extensive than Golitsyn claimed. To Angleton and his supporters, this made Nosenko automatically suspect. He was either a false defector sent by the KGB to discredit Golitsyn, or he was a genuine defector whose information had been carefully selected to serve Soviet deception objectives. Nosenko was held in solitary confinement for more than 3 years, while CIA interrogators tried to break him down and force him to admit his true mission. The treatment violated every principle of humane interrogation and produced no useful intelligence, but it satisfied the psychological needs of counterintelligence officers who had convinced themselves that they were fighting a secret war where normal rules of evidence and due process did not apply. The hunt consumed resources and attention that should have been devoted to understanding genuine Soviet capabilities and intentions. Operations officers, who might have developed productive sources inside the Soviet Union, were instead assigned to investigate their own colleagues. Intelligence analysts, who might have provided policymakers with accurate assessments of Soviet military strength and political dynamics, were instead tasked with finding hidden patterns of deception in every piece of information that crossed their desks. The British experience paralleled the American obsession, but with distinctly British characteristics that reflected the class-based nature of their intelligence services and the particular vulnerabilities created by Cambridge University's role as a recruiting ground for both MI5 and MI6. The exposure of Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald McLean, and Anthony Blunt as long-term Soviet agents had created genuine security concerns, but it also created an atmosphere where any officer with the wrong political views, the wrong social connections, or the wrong sexual orientation could become a target of investigation. Roger Hollis, the Director General of MI5, from 1956 to 1965, became the primary target of British mole hunters, who convinced themselves that only penetration at the highest levels could explain the intelligence failures and operational setbacks that had plagued British intelligence throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. The investigation of Hollis consumed enormous resources and created deep divisions within MI5 that persisted for decades, but it produced no evidence of treachery because there was none to find. The Canadian experience was perhaps the most tragic, because it destroyed the career of Leslie James Bennett, a dedicated intelligence officer who was targeted by paranoid theories rather than evidence. Bennett, a civilian employee of the RCMP Security Service, was investigated based on speculation by Claire Petty, one of Angleton's subordinates, who had become convinced that Soviet penetration extended throughout the Western Alliance. The investigation of Bennett involved consultation with Golitsyn, whose theories about Soviet operations were treated as gospel truth rather than unverified allegations from a defector whose own motivations and reliability had never been properly established. Bennett was dismissed from his position in 1972 without being charged with any crime, and the scandal contributed to the decision to remove internal security responsibilities from the RCMP and create a civilian intelligence service. The institutional damage caused by the mole hunts was compounded by their impact on individual lives and careers. Officers who had devoted their lives to protecting their countries found themselves under suspicion, subjected to hostile interrogation, and often destroyed professionally. Even when investigations failed to produce evidence of wrongdoing, the psychological pressure of working in an environment where colleagues might be reporting on each other to counterintelligence investigators created a culture of fear and mistrust that made effective intelligence work virtually impossible. But the mole hunts were not entirely without foundation, and this is what made them so seductive to intelligence officers who were genuinely concerned about security. The Soviet Union had indeed penetrated Western intelligence services, and some of the concerns raised by Golitsyn and other defectors were legitimate, even if their proposed solutions were counterproductive. The KGB's approach to penetrating Western intelligence reflected sophisticated understanding of how democratic societies and their intelligence services operated, rather than relying solely on ideological recruitment of committed communists. Soviet intelligence officers learned to exploit personal vulnerabilities, financial problems, sexual indiscretions, career disappointments, psychological weaknesses that could be used to compromise individuals who might never have considered themselves potential traitors. The recruitment process was typically gradual, beginning with seemingly innocent contact that slowly escalated into a relationship where the target became increasingly compromised and found it increasingly difficult to break free. Soviet intelligence officers were patient, willing to invest years in developing a single source, and sophisticated in their understanding of Western psychology and bureaucratic culture. The most successful Soviet penetrations were often accomplished not by placing dedicated agents in sensitive positions, but by recruiting individuals who were already in those positions and who could be motivated by money, ideology, revenge, or psychological manipulation to betray their trust. This approach was more reliable than trying to insert deep cover agents who might be exposed by security investigations, and it allowed Soviet intelligence to target specific positions and capabilities that were of particular interest. Operation Ryan, revealed through Oleg Gordievsky's intelligence, reporting to Ms. 6, illustrated the sophisticated nature of Soviet intelligence collection requirements and the extensive networks that had been developed to satisfy them. Ryan was a KGB program designed to provide early warning of Western preparations for a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union, and it required intelligence officers stationed throughout NATO countries to monitor a wide range of indicators that might suggest such preparations were underway. The operation revealed both the paranoia that characterized Soviet leadership thinking during the early 1980s and the extensive intelligence collection capabilities that the KGB had developed in Western countries. Officers were instructed to monitor everything from unusual activity at government buildings to patterns of blood bank collections that might indicate preparation for nuclear war, and the scope of the requirements suggested that Soviet intelligence had sources in positions where they could observe and report on the most sensitive aspects of Western military and political planning. Gordievsky's reporting on Operation Ryan provided Western intelligence with insights into Soviet thinking and capabilities that would have been impossible to obtain through technical collection methods alone. His intelligence revealed that Soviet leaders genuinely feared that the West might launch a preemptive nuclear attack, and this intelligence helped Western policymakers understand how their own actions and rhetoric were being interpreted by Moscow, contributing to efforts to reduce tensions and improve communication between the superpowers. But Gordievsky's case also illustrated the dangerous game that double agents played and the personal costs that intelligence work imposed on individuals who found themselves caught between competing loyalties and conflicting demands. Gordievsky had been recruited by MI6 in the early 1970s, while serving as a KGB officer in Copenhagen, motivated by his disillusionment with the Soviet system and his belief that improved East-West relations served the interests of both sides. For more than a decade, Gordievsky provided MI6 with intelligence about KGB operations, Soviet policy deliberations, and Moscow's assessment of Western intentions, while simultaneously advancing his own career within the KGB and eventually becoming the service's resident in London. The psychological pressure of maintaining this double life was enormous, and Gordievsky lived in constant fear of exposure and the inevitable consequences that would follow. The British intelligence service that handled Gordievsky had learned from the paranoid excesses of the Angleton era and developed more sophisticated approaches to agent management that balanced security concerns with operational effectiveness. Rather than assuming that every piece of intelligence was part of an elaborate deception, British intelligence officers learned to evaluate information based on multiple sources and corroborating evidence, and they developed techniques for verifying the reliability of their sources without destroying their usefulness. The extraction of Gordievsky from Moscow in July 1985 represented one of the most successful intelligence operations of the Cold War, demonstrating that Western intelligence services had retained their effectiveness despite the damage caused by years of mole hunting and internal suspicion. The operation required months of planning, sophisticated understanding of Soviet security procedures, and precise coordination between multiple intelligence services. But it succeeded in bringing Gordievsky safely to the West, where his knowledge could be fully exploited. The timing of Gordievsky's extraction coincided with other developments that were beginning to reveal the true extent of Soviet penetration of Western intelligence services and the effectiveness of traditional counterintelligence methods when they were applied with appropriate discipline and restraint. In August 1985, Vitaly Yurchenko defected from the KGB in Rome and provided the CIA with information that led to the identification of two significant Soviet agents, Ronald Pelton, who had provided the KGB with information about National Security Agency technical collection programs, and Edward Lee Howard, a former CIA officer who had defected to the Soviet Union after being dismissed from the agency. Yurchenko's defection initially appeared to validate traditional approaches to counterintelligence that emphasized careful evaluation of defector information and systematic investigation of security vulnerabilities. His information was specific, verifiable, and led to concrete results that improved Western security, demonstrating that effective counterintelligence did not require the paranoid excesses that had characterized the Angleton era. But Yurchenko's case took an unexpected turn in November 1985, when he announced at a press conference in Washington that he had been kidnapped by the CIA and held against his will, and then walked out of the room and returned to the Soviet embassy. His redefection raised questions about the entire episode that intelligence analysts are still debating decades later. Was Yurchenko a genuine defector who changed his mind, or was he a false defector whose mission was to provide the CIA with limited but valuable information in order to establish credibility for future disinformation operations? The debate over Yurchenko's true status illustrated the continuing challenges faced by counterintelligence officers who had to evaluate information from sources whose motivations and reliability could never be established with complete certainty. Unlike the paranoid certitude of the Angleton era, however, the post-Angleton generation of counterintelligence officers learned to live with ambiguity and to base their assessments on careful analysis of available evidence rather than elaborate theories about Soviet deception. The real breakthrough in Western understanding of Soviet penetration came not from defectors or elaborate counterintelligence theories, but from patient investigative work that followed traditional principles of criminal investigation adapted to the unique requirements of espionage cases. The identification and arrest of Aldrich Ames in February 1994 represented the culmination of a 9-year investigation that demonstrated both the extent of Soviet penetration and the effectiveness of disciplined counterintelligence work. Ames had been recruited by the KGB in 1985, while serving as a CIA case officer responsible for Soviet operations, and for 9 years, he provided his handlers with information that compromised more than 100 CIA operations and led to the execution of at least 10 Soviet citizens who had been working for American intelligence. The damage caused by Ames was far greater than anything imagined by the mole hunters of the Angleton era, but it was also more limited and specific than the massive penetrations alleged in Golitsyn's theories about the monster plot. The investigation that led to Ames's arrest was methodical rather than paranoid, focusing on specific security breaches rather than general theories about Soviet capabilities, and relying on evidence that could be verified independently rather than assumptions about enemy intentions. When CIA investigators realized that a significant number of their Soviet sources had been compromised, they began a systematic analysis of who had access to information about those sources and when that access had occurred. The investigation team, led by experienced counterintelligence officers who had learned from the mistakes of the Angleton era, resisted the temptation to assume massive penetration and instead focused on identifying the specific vulnerabilities that had been exploited. Their analysis revealed that the compromised operations had been known to a relatively small number of CIA officers, and that the timing of the compromises suggested that the penetration was ongoing rather than historical. The team then applied traditional investigative techniques to identify which of the officers with access to the compromised information exhibited behavior that might indicate clandestine contact with foreign intelligence services. They analyzed financial records, travel patterns, work habits, and personal relationships, looking for anomalies that might suggest involvement in espionage activities. Ames emerged as the primary suspect through the systematic process of elimination and evidence analysis. His financial situation had improved dramatically beginning in 1985, without any apparent legitimate source of additional income. He had exhibited unusual interest in operations that were subsequently compromised, and his behavior had become increasingly erratic and unreliable in ways that suggested he was under psychological pressure. The final phase of the investigation involved intensive surveillance that documented Ames's clandestine contacts with KGB handlers and his use of traditional espionage tradecraft to communicate with them. The surveillance operation lasted for months and required sophisticated coordination between the FBI, CIA, and other government agencies. But it produced evidence that could be used to secure Ames's arrest and conviction. The arrest of Robert Hanssen in February 2001 revealed that the FBI had also been penetrated by Soviet and later Russian intelligence, and that the problem of penetration was not limited to the CIA or to the Cold War period. Hanssen had provided the KGB and its successor service with information about FBI counterintelligence operations for more than 20 years, compromising numerous operations and causing damage that may never be fully assessed. Like the Ames case, the investigation that led to Hanssen's arrest was based on careful analysis of security breaches rather than paranoid theories about massive penetration, and it demonstrated that effective counterintelligence required patience, discipline, and systematic attention to evidence rather than the dramatic confrontations and elaborate theories that had characterized earlier mole hunts. The Hanssen case also revealed the psychological profile of individuals who chose to betray their countries and colleagues for money rather than ideology. Unlike the Cambridge spies who had been recruited based on their political beliefs, both Ames and Hanssen appeared to be motivated primarily by financial considerations and personal resentment rather than commitment to communist ideology or belief in Soviet political systems. This evolution in the motivation and recruitment of Western intelligence officers by Soviet and Russian intelligence reflected broader changes in the international environment and in the nature of intelligence work itself. As the ideological appeal of communism declined and the Cold War ended, intelligence services on both sides were forced to adapt their recruitment and operational methods to new realities. The economic opportunities available in post-Cold War societies created new vulnerabilities that could be exploited by foreign intelligence services, while the increased complexity and technical sophistication of modern intelligence work created new requirements for the kinds of information that foreign intelligence services wanted to obtain. The old model of ideological recruitment gave way to more transactional relationships based on financial incentives and professional opportunities. But the end of the Cold War also created new opportunities for Western counterintelligence services to understand and counter foreign intelligence operations. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to the defection of numerous former KGB officers who provided detailed information about decades of intelligence operations. Then the opening of archival material in former Soviet bloc countries revealed the scope and methods of communist intelligence services. The Mitrokhin archive, smuggled to the West by former KGB archivist Vasily Mitrokhin, provided unprecedented insight into Soviet intelligence operations spanning several decades and covering operations in dozens of countries. The archive revealed that Soviet intelligence had been far more extensive and successful than Western intelligence services had realized. But it also showed that the actual scope of operations was more limited and specific than the paranoid theories of the Angleton era had suggested. The archive documented specific operations, identified individual agents, and revealed the methods and priorities that had guided Soviet intelligence work, providing a factual foundation for understanding the threat that had been posed by communist intelligence services. This information allowed Western intelligence services to assess the damage that had been caused by past penetrations and to develop more effective countermeasures against future operations. The lessons learned from decades of mole hunting and counterintelligence work during the Cold War period continue to influence how Western intelligence services approach the challenge of protecting their operations and personnel from foreign intelligence penetration. The experience demonstrated both the reality of the threat posed by hostile intelligence services and the dangers of responding to that threat with excessive paranoia and internal suspicion. Effective counterintelligence requires a balance between appropriate security measures and operational effectiveness, between healthy skepticism and destructive paranoia, between protection of sources and methods and the need to share information with allies and policymakers. The mole hunters of the Angleton era lost that balance and caused enormous damage to the institutions they were trying to protect. The success of later counterintelligence operations against Ames, Hansen, and other genuine spies demonstrated that foreign intelligence penetration could be detected and countered through careful investigative work based on evidence rather than theory, systematic analysis rather than paranoid speculation, and patient surveillance rather than hostile interrogation. The institutional memory of intelligence services includes both the successes and failures of counterintelligence work, and the professionals who staff these organizations today understand that their effectiveness depends on learning from both kinds of experience. The paranoid excesses of the mole hunting era serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing security concerns to override operational judgment and professional ethics. The human cost of intelligence work extends beyond the agents and officers who risk their lives in foreign countries or who spend their careers protecting national security information from unauthorized disclosure. The mole hunts of the Cold War period destroyed careers, broke up families, and created lasting psychological damage for individuals who found themselves caught up in investigations based on suspicion rather than evidence. The families of intelligence officers often paid the highest price for the paranoia and suspicion that characterized the mole hunting era, as breadwinners lost their jobs and their reputations based on allegations that could never be proven or disproven conclusively. Children grew up in households where their parents' work could not be discussed, and where the family's security and stability could be threatened by factors beyond their understanding or control. The legacy of the mole hunting era continues to influence how intelligence services approach personnel, security, and counterintelligence today. But the lessons learned from that experience have led to more balanced and effective approaches that protect legitimate security interests without destroying the careers and lives of innocent people. The transformation of counterintelligence from a paranoid witch hunt into a professional discipline based on evidence and analysis represents one of the most significant institutional changes in the intelligence community during the post-Cold War period. The professionals who work in this field today understand that their mission is to protect their organizations and their countries from genuine threats, not to pursue elaborate theories about enemy deception and penetration. The democratic societies that Western intelligence services serve require these organizations to operate within legal and ethical constraints that may make their work more difficult, but also ensure that intelligence activities remain consistent with the values and principles that these societies are trying to protect. The excesses of the mole hunting era violated those constraints and damaged the credibility and effectiveness of intelligence services in ways that took decades to repair. The oversight mechanisms that have been established to monitor intelligence activities and ensure compliance with legal and ethical standards reflect the lessons learned from the mole hunting era and other periods when intelligence services exceeded their proper authority or allowed security concerns to override other important considerations. The international cooperation that characterizes modern counterintelligence work is based on trust and shared values that would have been impossible to maintain during the paranoid atmosphere of the Angleton era, when Western intelligence services were more suspicious of each other than they were effective at cooperating against common threats. The technological capabilities that are available to modern intelligence services provide new opportunities for detecting and countering foreign intelligence operations, but they also create new vulnerabilities that require constant vigilance and adaptation. The professionals who work in counterintelligence today must understand both the technological and human dimensions of the threats they face. The training and professional development of counterintelligence officers today emphasizes analytical skills, investigative techniques, and understanding of legal and ethical constraints, rather than the elaborate theories and paranoid assumptions that characterize the mole hunting era. These professionals are taught to base their assessments on evidence that can be verified independently and to resist the temptation to see patterns of deception where none exist. The measurement of success in counterintelligence work has evolved from the dramatic confrontations and spectacular arrests that characterized the mole hunting era to more subtle indicators of effectiveness that may be less visible to the public, but more meaningful in terms of protecting national security interests. The public understanding of intelligence work has been shaped by the revelations about mole hunting and other controversial intelligence activities, leading to greater awareness of both the necessity and the dangers of intelligence work in democratic societies. This understanding has contributed to the development of oversight mechanisms and legal frameworks that seek to balance security requirements with democratic values. The academic study of intelligence has grown significantly since the Cold War period, producing scholarship that provides historical perspective on events like the mole hunts, while also contributing to better understanding of how intelligence organizations can operate effectively within democratic societies. The declassification of historical documents and the availability of memoirs and other accounts by participants in intelligence activities have provided unprecedented insight into the decision-making processes and institutional dynamics that shaped intelligence work during the Cold War period, contributing to more informed public debate about the proper role of intelligence services in democratic societies. Where once there had been only shadows and speculation, there is now a substantial body of evidence that allows historians and analysts to assess the effectiveness of intelligence operations and the accuracy of the theories that guided them. The mole hunts of the Cold War era can now be evaluated based on what actually happened rather than what participants believed was happening at the time. The verdict is clear. The paranoid approach to counterintelligence that characterized the Angleton era was counterproductive, damaging the institutions it was supposed to protect, and failing to identify the genuine threats that did exist. The more disciplined and evidence-based approaches that replaced it have been more successful at detecting and countering foreign intelligence operations while avoiding the collateral damage that characterized earlier periods. The story of the mole hunts serves as a reminder that in the shadow world of intelligence work, the greatest threats often come not from foreign enemies, but from the fear, suspicion, and paranoia that can consume organizations from within, turning protectors into destroyers and allies, into enemies in a wilderness of mirrors where nothing is quite what it seems. The institutions that survived this period of trial by paranoia emerged stronger and more effective, having learned to balance security concerns with operational requirements and democratic values. They carry forward the memory of both triumph and tragedy, success and failure, serving as guardians, not only of national security secrets, but of the hard-won knowledge that effective intelligence work requires wisdom as well as vigilance, judgment as well as suspicion, and above all, the courage to admit when zealousness has crossed the line into destructive paranoia. In the end, the West struck back, not through elaborate counterintelligence operations or paranoid mole hunts, but through patient investigative work, international cooperation, and the gradual development of professional standards that balance security requirements with respect for individual rights and democratic institutions. The real victory was not the arrest of any particular spy or the exposure of any specific operation, but the transformation of counterintelligence from a destructive force that consumed its own institutions into a professional discipline that could protect democratic societies while preserving the values that made them worth protecting. The lessons of this transformation remain relevant today as intelligence services face new challenges and new threats that require the same balance of vigilance and restraint, the same commitment to evidence-based analysis over paranoid speculation, and the same understanding that the institutions they protect are only as strong as the principles upon which they are founded. In the quiet offices and conference rooms where intelligence professionals work today, the ghosts of the mole-hunting era serve as silent reminders of the dangers of losing that balance, of allowing fear to overcome judgment, and of forgetting that in the intelligence business, as in all human endeavors, the greatest enemy is often not the adversary across the ocean, but the darkness that lies within the human heart itself.